सर बहुत शुक्रिया आपका। तो शुरू करते हैं आज वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर ट्रांजिशंस एंड पाकिस्तान 21st सेंचुरी। तो थैंक यू वेरी मच। तो आप शुरू कीजिए।
Thank you so much, Shahid Saab. Pakistan has a very important role to play in the world order, though it is not the kind of role that perhaps we would want to play, given a free choice in defining our role. If you look at Pakistan's role during the Cold War, if you look at Pakistan's role during the unipolar moment of the mid 90s to early 2000s, if you look at Pakistan's role during the war on terror, and if you look at how things are likely to shape up in the event of a second Cold War erupting, this time between the Chinese and the Americans, Pakistan and states like Pakistan are basically the cannon fodder in these conflicts. That is to say, the Cold War or the world order might be cold for some or ordered for others, but for a state in Pakistan's position, it is the turbulence of that period, it is the ill effects of that period that come raining down on you. There's a very good book by a Pakistani scholar, Imrana Begum, on the effects of the Soviet-Afghan war on Pakistan, which looks at how that war, in a more precise manner, rewrote and changed the social fabric and economic fabric as well as the politics of Pakistan. And we might well say that even at this point in time, a lot of Pakistan's problems stem from what happened during the 1980s with reference to the Soviet-Afghan war. So these things have a very, very profound impact on countries like ours who are drawn into these conflicts, who end up paying a high price very often for somebody else's victory, and who then try to extract from their participation in one or the other alliance or opportunity that they might have some advantages for themselves. So, the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear power today has a lot to do with the fact that Pakistan sided with the United States in the Soviet-Afghan conflict. And for about a decade or so, the heat was off your nuclear program, so you were able to cross critical thresholds and achieve the status of an albeit undeclared nuclear power at that time. So there are some things which countries in Pakistan's position do manage to extract, but these transitions are always very, very painful. And if you look at the scorecard from Pakistan's 21st century, which is now ending its first quarter in 2025, you'll again see, a recurrence of crises starting after 9/11, continuing on with various crises with India, and even today, Pakistan keeps finding itself drawn into taking positions on world affairs, on different matters of broader global geopolitics. So, this is something which is not necessarily under the control of Pakistan's leaders. But what it means is that Pakistan has to make hard choices, and those hard choices have huge consequences for your people, for your economy, for what options are available to you in dealing with your internal problems. Now, world order itself is a very interesting topic. And it's a very interesting topic because there really has been only one world order in the sense of global order in human history. And that world order was the one that was essentially imposed through force of arms on the rest of the world by the Europeans. So, until the European age of empire, there was no world order. There were, of course, certain regional orders. So, China was the center of an East Asian regional order. The different Indian states, including large states like the Delhi Sultanate or the Mughal Empire, were the central points of an Indian Ocean order. The empires of West Asia, like the Safavids or the Ottomans, or if you go further back in time, the Achaemenians or the Arab Empire, they were the center of a West Asian or trans-Mediterranean order. And then if you look at empires like Rome, that too was basically an order centered around the Mediterranean. So the world really did not have a center until, let's say, the year 1700 to 1750. That is when the world actually acquires a center. And that center is clearly constructed in the form of a core made up of the conquering European states who also fight each other. So the core is not stable, it is an unstable core, but at least as far as the periphery is concerned, the core might appear stable from a distance. So if you're being conquered or colonized by the English or the French or the Spanish or the Portuguese or the Dutch, that is an important difference, but it still represents different variations of European overseas colonization and conquest. So this world order was born out of that age of European empire. And within that European age of empire, different states occupied the prime position in the European pecking order. So if you look at the 1500s, you would probably think that Spain and to a lesser extent Portugal are number 1 and 2. And countries like France and England and the Netherlands have really yet to join the race for becoming overseas colonial empires. If you fast forward maybe 100 years or 200 years, you might see that, well, actually the British and French empires are now much more powerful, much more prosperous, and clearly a cut above those that are left in the possession of Spain and Portugal. And if you go during the period of 1850 to 1914, again you would perhaps think that the British are now clearly far ahead of the other European colonial powers. The sun never sets on the British Empire. A quarter of the world's population is under the rule of the British directly or indirectly. So within this balance, there are shifts that take place. So the core European states do fight each other, and that fighting has consequences. So for example, the British defeating the French in South Asia has very important consequences for our part of the world. The French succeeding in intervening in the war of the American colonies against the British has very important ramifications for the balance of power in North America. So there are these ups and downs that everybody goes through. But in this order, the Europeans are very, very much in charge. But the core remains unstable. Now, there is a reason why the core of Europe remains unstable. And this has to do with a very old problem of European history. And that problem is the problem of Central Europe. Central Europe, of course, is a somewhat ambiguous term, but let's say if you were to look at the modern day map of Europe, Central Europe would correspond roughly to Germany, Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Roughly that is the Central European territory. Now, this territory, from the dawn of European political history to the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, suffered from a fundamental problem. And that problem was that it was either too weak or too strong for the peace of Europe. So, when it was too strong, it threatened to dominate the rest of Europe, creating a coalition of states against it, ultimately leading to a balance of power emerging and the exhaustion of Central Europe. When it was too weak, however, it invited the attention and the intervention of the countries on the peripheries of Europe. So, between these two phases, Europe's history alternated with great violence, from the conflict between the Romans and the Germanic tribes down to the wars of the French Revolution. You see this antagonism continuing to roil the European continent, and on each occasion that you think that maybe a single power is about to emerge dominant in Europe, it is successfully contained, it overstretches itself, and the reverse direction starts to materialize. So Europe keeps experiencing this alternating pattern. Now, the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars devastate large parts of Europe. Literally from Russia to Spain to the Atlantic to Austria, Prussia, all these territories are subjected to extensive military operations, both by the French as they conquer them and then by the Allies as they sweep the French out of them. But at the end of this, the Europeans convene a very important meeting, a Congress, the Congress of Vienna. And at the Congress of Vienna, the Chancellor of the Austrian Empire, Metternich, he has a plan that he thinks will resolve this age-old problem of a Central Europe that is either too weak and therefore unable to defend itself, or so strong that it risks conquering the whole continent and triggers a war to contain it. That solution, he finds, is through a mechanism called the German Confederation. The idea is to unite practically all the Central European territories into a defense arrangement that will be under the presidency of Austria, and that will make it very difficult for either Russia or France, the two traditional antagonists in Central Europe, to intervene militarily. So the German Confederation, with its members, they will be able to cooperate and they will be able to deter aggression from the two historical sources of aggression into Central Europe. But at the same time, being made up of dozens of states, the German Confederation will be too disunited to pose an offensive threat to the countries on Europe's periphery. So, For Metternich, this can be a potentially stable arrangement. That in effect, Central Europe will be too strong to be attacked, but too disunited to go on the attack. Now, what this basically does is that it creates a century of great power peace in Europe. So during this period, the three great overseas and expansionist European empires, France and England being the two overseas empires, and Russia being the continental expansionist power towards the east, they are able to focus their energies on their expansion. They are able to direct their energies at acquiring, expanding, and consolidating their overseas colonies. So, the peace of Europe, if you will, that is arranged at the Congress of Vienna, creates this arrangement of five great powers: Austria, Prussia, France, England, and Russia. But within these five great powers, there is a clear bifurcation because Russia, France, and England are the three truly great powers with global interests, and Austria and Prussia, while they are militarily significant, they are contained in terms of their interests and ambitions within Europe. So Austria is not looking to acquire overseas colonies, neither is Prussia. They're kept within Europe. So you have the two European powers, and then you have the three European global empires. And this arrangement is, of course, a wonderful arrangement for these three European empires. It is, of course, a terrible arrangement for everybody else because it means that the British, French, and Russians can basically hammer away at people all over the world, whether they're in Africa or in Asia or wherever, and expand their territory. So, this creates something which is very central to the European order, that the core is stable and relatively peaceful, but the periphery is unstable and being repeatedly subjected to a great deal of violence by the states at the core. And that is how each of these three big empires tries to rearrange its own sphere of influence. Now, these three big empires, of course, have certain very important differences, disagreements amongst themselves. One disagreement is that they can't quite come to an understanding of how to dispose of the territory of the Ottoman Empire. So, when Tsar Nicholas I meets with Metternich, I think this is in 1833, Tsar Nicholas asks of Metternich that, well, what do you think of the Turk? Is he not a very, very sick man? From which we get the phrase sick man of Europe in terms of the Ottomans. And Metternich replies to the Tsar that, are you asking me as the doctor or as the heir? Because the two countries were at odds because they had competing claims in the Balkans. And these competing claims, as we'll just see, actually trigger the First World War. So there is this competition. There are still, relatively speaking, minor conflicts or shorter conflicts or limited conflicts that break out. So you have the Crimean War of 1853 to 56. You also have minor skirmishes on the colonial front between, let's say, the French and the British. They are competing for influence. So there are tensions of that nature. The British, in particular, are playing a great game as they see it with the Russians for the approaches towards Central Asia and South Asia and West Asia. So there is that element of geopolitical competition even amongst these three big empires. But fundamentally, they are not going to wage an all out war for each other's destruction. They are cohabiting, if you will. Now, this all starts to change as a result of the spread of an ideology. And that ideology originates in the wars of the French Revolution and represents a combination of nationalism and idea that people who share the same ethnicity and language and occupy contiguous territories ought to form national states or nation states. So, in the context of Central Europe, Austria has a big problem with nationalism. And the reason why the Austrian Empire has a big problem with nationalism is that within the Austrian Empire, there are about 11 major nationalities. The Germans are about 20% of the population of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they are clearly the dominant group in terms of the army, the bureaucracy, the intelligentsia, the royal court, and all other important offices. So the spread of nationalism within the Austro-Hungarian Empire is a big problem for the Austrian government because the majority of the people they rule are not German. They are Hungarians, or they are Czechs, or they are different types of Slavs. So they obviously cannot be integrated into an Austrian national state. In fact, nationalism would lead to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But in the northern part of the German Confederation, you have Prussia. And Prussia has long been the number two of the Austrians. They've all long been the major supporting power of the Austrians. And for a long time, the Prussians have been loyal followers of the lead provided by the Austrians. But the younger generation of German leaders, including men like Bismarck, feel that Austria is actually an impediment to German prosperity and the Germans being able to play a role that is commensurate with their overall strength. So he and others who think like him increasingly demand that Prussia unify the German territories into a single state, that if necessary, it evict the Austrians and their influence from those territories. And it also, they should defeat anyone who attempts to interfere with their project of unification. So when Bismarck becomes the chancellor, he embarks upon a program aimed precisely at bringing about the unification of Germany. In 1864, he is able to seize territories from Denmark. In 1866, the Prussians decisively defeat the Austrians. And then in 1870, they also decisively defeat the French. And it is in 1871, in Versailles, that the German Empire is proclaimed. So the creation of the German Empire means that now there is a fourth potential great power. Bismarck is reluctant to pursue an immediate program of overseas expansion. His view basically is that now that Germany has been unified, it should focus on its economic and industrial development, which occurs very rapidly after unification. It should focus on the well being of its people. He actually creates the world's first welfare state. It should focus on building up its science and its technology to a level that is at par with the British. But it should avoid getting entangled with great power rivalries, and it should instead declare itself to be a satisfied power. That is to say, it has no further claims on anybody. Now, Bismarck's nightmare is what he calls the nightmare of encirclement, which is to say that he knows from his understanding of European history that whenever a powerful, assertive state has emerged in the center of Europe, the result has been its encirclement by the weaker states and the eventual exhaustion and defeat of the Central European power. That is the fate that awaited the Habsburgs when they attempted to unify the subcontinent under their rule. That is likely the fate that will befall Germany if it were to try to do the same thing. So, for Bismarck, the policy of restraint means that Germany should achieve, through its own gradual development, a bandwagoning effect. That if Germany becomes strong enough and rich enough, then other European states will start to follow its lead. And this will therefore avoid this nightmare of encirclement. Now, Bismarck is let go in 1890, and his successors and the new German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, they have very different ideas about Germany. They think that the old man, that is to say Bismarck, was too cautious. He was too restrained. One of his successors as Chancellor even complained that Bismarck's policies were too complicated, very hard to understand. A simpler policy would be a lot better. And as a consequence, the new German government embarks upon what it calls a global policy, a demand that Germany should have its place in the sun, a demand that Germany should be consulted not as a continental power, but as a top-tier power, at par with the Russians, the French, and the British. Now, understandably, the three existing global empires don't take this very kindly. They don't want to share. And why should they? Why should any great power give up a share of its power except as a result of an actual defeat? So if the Germans want to be a world power, then, well, they're going to have to fight for it. And if they're not prepared to fight for it, then they should just relax and be a very important European power, but that will be the limit of their ambition, and that should be the limit of their influence. This upsets the Kaiser, and it leads him to start putting more pressure on the Russians. And in 1894, Russia concludes a military alliance with France. The Germans then announced that, well, we're going to build a navy that will be comparable in strength to the British Navy. And this triggers the end of the British policy of isolation from continental affairs. So in 1902, the British signed the Anglo-Japanese Naval Accords. In 1904, they entered into the Entente with the French. And in 1907, they set aside their differences with the Russians and establish a triple Entente that is directed against Germany. So this nightmare of encirclement is completed within a decade or so, decade and a half or so of Bismarck's exit. Now, once this polarization has taken place, Europe enters a period of Cold War between Germany and Austria on one side and these three global empires on the other side. The difference, of course, is between this very brief Cold War and the Soviet American Cold War is that nobody has nuclear weapons. So there is no nuclear deterrent. All the sides are also convinced that through the application of better technology, better mobilization schedules, more effective internal communications, they can rapidly defeat the other party. So in a way, everybody is convinced that if a war happens, the war is going to be cheap, it is going to be quick, and it is going to be decisive. So naturally, the decision to go to war is something which is not taken as a last resort. In fact, because of the alliances, everybody is convinced that showing that they are prepared to go to war is absolutely vital in order to maintain the credibility of their alliance. So you have this polarization, and the effects of this polarization are felt in relation to the Ottoman Empire. In 1908, there is a Young Turk revolution in Turkey. The Austrians, taking advantage of the situation in Turkey, seized control of Bosnia-Herzegovina. In 1911, the Italians invade and occupy Ottoman Libya. In 1912, the Balkan states fight against the Ottomans. And then in 1913, the Balkan states fight each other. So you now have a recurrence of these crises. And every time there is a crisis, there is always a risk that one or more of the great powers will get involved. And if any one of the great powers mobilizes against any other great power or ally of a great power, this will basically trigger an all-out war. That is, of course, what happens when the Archduke of Austria gets assassinated on the 28th of June 1914. He is assassinated by a Serbian terrorist, Gavrilo Princip, who belongs to a terrorist organization known as the Black Hand. The Black Hand is supported by the Serbian government as it attempts to destabilize Austria's control of the Slavic territories that it rules. The Austrians are outraged. They decide that this is an excellent opportunity to dismantle Serbia for good, and they seek assurances from their German allies that, well, you will come to support us. The Germans say, yes, we will support you to the hilt. And so the Austrians opt to actually go to war against Serbia. Problem is, Serbia is an ally of Russia. And the Russians are rather worried about the fact that in 1908, they didn't do anything to help their ally when the Austrians annexed Bosnia. Now the Russians feel if they do not come to the aid of their ally, their credibility as a great power will be undermined. So when Austria declares war on the Serbs on the 28th of July 1914, the Russians mobilized their army against the Austrians and the Germans. The Germans mobilized their army, and within a few days of this, the German army has invaded Belgium. Now, this is the beginning of an intense period of great power conflict, not only within Europe, but as the title of these conflicts would indicate, World War I, World War II, these conflicts also spill outside of Europe and become truly global conflicts, especially in the context of World War II. And in the course of the First World War, and again in the course of the Second World War, you see a very similar thing happening in that the Germans attempt to bring the rest of Europe under their control. They achieve certain successes, but ultimately the balance of power turns against them, and Germany is exhausted and it is ultimately defeated. In World War I, this defeat is milder than that suffered in World War II, but the outcome of both is the same. So, when we look at this world order transition, we can immediately see a few things that are extremely relevant to our own time. The reason I say this is because before the First World War, Germany and England actually had highly integrated economies. They traded with each other extensively, they had very good investment relations. The Germans and the British, therefore, had an economic interest in avoiding a conflict precisely because of this integration. If you look at the literature produced about Germany from that time in England, you see a very interesting replay of the current dynamic between China and the United States. The British are losing ground industrially. As Germany becomes more industrialized, it is overtaking the United Kingdom, not only in terms of total industrial output, but also in terms of the quality of that industrial output. And as the British lose their status of the workshop of the world to the Germans, British politicians and British leaders are extremely worried about what this means for the long-term stability of the UK pound sterling, which is the then global currency, for the overall stability of the British economy, which is heavily dependent increasingly on imports in order to survive, what it means for the long-term military potential of the United Kingdom. If the Germans are building better battleships and they have better machine guns and they have better artillery, what is going to happen in the future? So the thinking of the British ruling circles is perhaps best captured by a memorandum written by a senior British diplomat. His last name was Crowe, C-R-O-W-E. And the Crowe Memorandum is one of the very important documents, if you will, of the years leading up to the First World War. In that memorandum, what Crowe basically says is that Germany's intentions are irrelevant. What matters is Germany's capabilities. It is simply not acceptable that there ought to be another state with capabilities greater than the United Kingdom's. So, nothing personal. We just have to stop the Germans because they will soon have a capability greater than ours. And the implication of this, of course, since the balance of power is moving in favor of the Germans in terms of industry, science, technology, economy, all of that, the longer a war is delayed, the stronger Germany will be when that war occurs. So the British and their allies have an interest in fighting the Germans sooner rather than later, given the way in which the Germans are becoming stronger than everybody else. What this also basically means is that the British, and by this time the French and the Russians, they are not going to simply accept Germany as a co-equal simply because the Germans are now manufacturing better automobiles and have excellent medicine and are overtaking them in higher education and other such things. If the Germans want to translate their increasingly superior economic and scientific potential into global hard power, let's put it that way, they're going to have to do so over the dead bodies of England, France, and Russia. You know, two tigers can't occupy the same mountaintop. So, this is a very important aspect of when we think about world order. That world order is essentially imposed by force. It is sustained by force. It reflects the global balance of power at any point in time. Yes, the great powers do like to talk about international law at some times, but that's essentially window dressing, because when it comes to the real interests of any given state, no state recognizes any authority higher than its own, except when compelled to do so by the power of another state or coalition of states. So, this thinking is very much present during the US-Soviet Cold War. So, when you look at the thinking of the Soviets and the Americans about each other, it is remarkably similar. Of course, the Soviets represent a socialist economic and social system. The Americans represent a capitalist economic and social system. The Soviets, they have a one-party communist state. The Americans are a multi-party democracy. So there are very important differences in terms of how these states and societies are internally constructed. There are also very important differences in terms of what a victory for one or the other would mean for the rest of the world. But they are both increasingly clear on one thing as the Second World War draws to a close. As the Second World War draws to a close, Europe is exhausted, effectively partitioned into an American and Soviet sphere of influence. The Europeans are now set to lose their overseas colonies. If the European colonial power is somewhat intelligent, like the British, they'll negotiate a transfer of power and get out of there themselves. If the European colonial power wants to do things the hard way, like the French, they'll be militarily defeated by their colonial subjects and kicked out by force. But either way, that age of European colonial empire is coming to an end. So a third world is emerging. The Soviets and the Americans are both quite clear that their system and their interests and their prerogatives should dominate in the third world. They're also quite clear that ultimately there can be no coexistence between their rival systems. So the Soviet goal is to essentially create a universal state focused on Moscow that will be a Marxist-Leninist utopia. The Americans are also seeking unipolarity. they are also seeking to bring about what Fukuyama would famously call an end of history. But of course, their end of history is not a Marxist Leninist utopia, but a liberal capitalist one. But either ways, the goal is the same, that the Soviets and the Americans are very similar to each other because they are not seeking to operate within an international system. They are essentially seeking to become the international system and to establish unipolarity. Now, the reason why the Soviets and the Americans don't actually quickly get into a third world war is the fact that they have nuclear weapons. The Americans have them first, the Soviets acquired them by 1949, and then both sides rapidly expand the quality and the authenticity and the quantity of their nuclear weapons. And what this basically means is that the two sides want to destroy each other, and that remains the goal, but they realize that it would be suicidal to attempt a direct attack on the enemy. So we enter this period of nuclear deterrence, if you will, or Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans. And in this Cold War, Europe is in a way frozen into its 1945 condition. And the rest of the world, of course, is unfrozen. And the Americans and the Soviets compete with each other, they fight proxy wars against each other, they support revolutionary movements against each other, they use terrorism against each other, they use sabotage against each other. Basically, they do a lot of really, really bad things to each other, but they stop short of using direct military force upon each other. The closest they come to a direct use of force is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which fortunately ends without that direct use of force. And thereafter, the two sides generally avoid getting into those types of very dangerous situations. So, in a way, nuclear deterrence keeps a kind of peace between these two rival superpowers. Though for the rest of the world, of course, there is no peace. The Cold War is very much a hot war for everybody else. Now, in this context, Pakistan actually plays a surprisingly important role. And this role takes the shape of two very important, I would argue, strategically vital outcomes of the Cold War that work in the United States' favor. The first of these is that Pakistan plays an instrumental role in bringing about the normalization of relations between the United States and China. So it's very interesting if you look at, let's say, the American leaders, they were actually extremely unhappy with the fact in the 1950s and early 1960s that Pakistan is having, good relations with the Chinese. And the Americans, of course, at that time saw the Chinese as a kind of satellite state, a vassal state of the Soviets, that the Soviets were using as a proxy in different conflicts. And they weren't entirely wrong in that assessment. China had acted as a Soviet proxy during the Korean War. It also played a very important role during the Vietnam War in supporting the Vietnamese against the Americans. But this ideological blinker on part of the Americans seemed to blind them to the overall complexity of Chinese national security interests. And over time, when the Americans themselves started to realize that there was actually a potential for normalization with the Chinese, that the Chinese were not happy with the Soviets at many levels, that the United States should seek an opening to the Chinese. And the one country which the Chinese and the Americans could both trust to communicate their messages confidentially was Pakistan. In fact, just on an aside, there's a hilarious episode where one time when one of our diplomats was traveling to Washington DC to deliver one of the messages, he was so jet lagged that he actually fell asleep and missed his flight. And so he had to take the next flight, but in the meanwhile, there was a lot of panic at the American end that where is the courier? And he said, this was before the age of mobile phones or anything. So that actually happened, but that's just part of the small things that happen in these situations. So that was one very important deliverable. China's switching sides during the Cold War effectively exposes the vast inland frontier of the Soviet Union to sustain military pressure. It, in many ways, is a reversal in the Cold War that openly breaks the purported unity of the communist camp. And it also means that the United States and China, as they steadily improve their relationship, and then post 79, you start seeing various economic reforms in China that begins opening up their economy to Western investment and other such things, that China apparently starts to head towards a comprehensive normalization with the Western world. So that is, of course, a huge victory for the Americans in the context of the Cold War. The second important deliverable from the Pakistani side is, of course, the Soviet-Afghan War and the support given by Pakistan to the United States' effort to basically turn Afghanistan into the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And this is another attempt which, from the American perspective, succeeds very well, in that it leads to a loss of prestige. It probably doesn't do that much in terms of actually diminishing the Soviet Union's military power, but it is followed so quickly by the collapse of the Eastern Bloc that it leads into the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. So it often seems as if that the events sort of bleed into each other, leading to the end of the Cold War and the victory of the United States. So after about 1992, the world enters a period of unipolarity. This really has never happened before. So, yes, during the 1800s, the British Empire was by far the most powerful empire, but it had to share space with the French and the Russians. It was, let's say, the first amongst equals as far as the European big powers were concerned. But over here, there is no question that the United States is not only the sole surviving superpower, but it is a hyperpower, a power that is dominant not just in terms of its military prowess or its political influence, but also in terms of its economic wealth, in terms of its science, its art, its culture, and that essentially when we talk about globalization, we are essentially talking about American globalization. We are talking about the universalization of the American economic system, the universalization of the American social system, its political system, its cultural system, its technology and its science, and all of this is universalized. So The dream of globalization is that of this period of very heady period in American history is that very soon people in Beijing will be living in a multi-party democracy, sending emails to each other and eating Big Macs, and we will have arrived at not just a metaphorical end of history, but an actual end of history, in the sense that after this point, there will be no further fundamental change in the political, social, or economic systems that human societies can adopt. There will all be variations of what the Americans have. Of course, there will be some differences still, but those differences will be relatively minor aesthetic differences, not substantive differences. And as a result of this, as the world is recreated in the image of the United States, and the rest of the world comes to share American values, they will also come to accept the legitimacy of American interests. So there will be a Pax Americana. The world will finally achieve peace under the benevolent dominion of the United States. Now, of course, none of that actually happened. And as it turned out, the world was and is a far more complicated, far more resistant, far messier place than the American elite might have imagined it to be in the flush of victory after the Cold War. So, when we enter the 21st century, there is a growing anxiety in the United States. One element of this anxiety, of course, is anxiety about specifically terrorism and the threat that terrorism can now pose to the American homeland and also key allies of the United States. So that's one element to it. Related to this is the fear that new power centers are starting to emerge, that globalization has in fact led to the transferring of a significant part of the world's industrial capability to non-Western societies. A growing awareness of the fact that those non-Western societies, while more than happy to embrace Western science and Western industry and technology, are not particularly keen in terms of embracing broader aspects of American culture or political philosophy or other such things. So, what is in fact happening is that the United States is overstretched. It has taken on global commitments. It is trying to maintain a unipolar sphere of influence, which no power has ever done in human history before. And its rivals or potential rivals are taking time, taking American investment, taking American technology, taking American science, and internalizing it and using it for their own development. So, this is where we start entering the transitional period in the thinking of the American elites, let's say, about their own place in the world. And in that thinking, the Germany to their England is effectively China. So, whether Democrat or Republican, whether liberal or conservative, the growing anxiety is that the Chinese are acquiring the potential to actually become a peer competitor of the United States. And what Western history teaches us is that peer competitors soon find themselves locked in either cold wars or hot wars with those who are fearful of their rise. Now, this again puts Pakistan in a very, very difficult position in the sense that Pakistan is a very close ally of the Chinese. It has also enjoyed periods of very good relations with the United States, but those periods of good relations have often been followed by long periods of very difficult relations, sometimes bordering on hostility between the US and Pakistan. So you have a stable friend and an erratic friend, let's just put it this way. So if you must choose between one of them, who should you choose? That is a very, very difficult question that Pakistan's policymakers may soon have to give a firm answer to. What basically happens in a Cold War situation, a serious Cold War situation, when both sides get into the spirit of things, is that if you are a big country, relatively speaking, you can probably play both sides to an extent. But if you happen to be in a geopolitically sensitive zone, or you happen to be economically weak, as Pakistan is, then you might have to make a categorical choice. And obviously, if you opt for one or the other, or even if you try to steer some sort of a middle course, trying to avoid getting dragged in for as long as possible, each of these has very, very serious consequences for the country concerned. Now, this transition would be incredibly difficult to navigate, even in the best of times. But a major complicating factor for Pakistan is that nuclear deterrence in our region has broken down. And this is something which, at least I feel, a lot of Pakistani policymakers are still in a bit of denial about, because the basic principle of nuclear deterrence is that you center the end cost of escalation in your calculations. So what nuclear deterrence does is that it basically eliminates the possibility of a direct conventional exchange between nuclear powers. Because in the event of a direct conventional exchange between nuclear powers, the threshold can very easily escalate, not intentionally, but simply by pressure of circumstances, into the use or perceived threat of use of nuclear weapons. And given that India and Pakistan both have about 170 nuclear weapons apiece, they have enough nukes to destroy each other. They also have enough nukes to trigger a global famine that would kill about 1 billion to 2 billion people on account of a mild nuclear winter. So this is a very, very serious problem, not just for India and Pakistan, but for the rest of the planet as well. But the problem is that as we enter this transition, more and more theaters are going from cold to hot. So you have a long-standing conflict now in Europe between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Middle East is basically being repulverized before our very eyes. Uh, India, Pakistan are now on the verge of another exchange, and the situation in terms of the Chinese and other East Asian states might also explode due to miscalculations or misperceptions on either side. So, if you look at the world, you basically see that uh, while this is not yet a world war, uh, we are living in a world where more and more states are at war with each other. So you have a lot of these pockets now, and it's only a matter of time before these pockets start to merge, unless they are successfully diffused. So for Pakistan, the next quarter of the, if we think about surviving to 2047, making it to the end of the second quarter of this century, it's going to be extremely difficult to navigate between the growing risk of a Sino-US Cold War and the basically perpetual risk that we now face of conflict reigniting with the Indians. And every time that happens, there is a very serious chance that it can trigger an all-out nuclear exchange between the two countries. So you really are in a very, very difficult situation. And this is, of course, added on top of other internal and serious issues of political stability or economic viability or other such things that the country continues to face. Okay? So we stop here. If you have any questions.
बहुत शुक्रिया सर जी जनाब क्वेश्चंस सर एक तो ये बताइए आपने पावर जो है ना रियलिस्ट पर्सपेक्टिव से उसकी बात की तो ये जो इक्वेशन बनता है पावर का और डिफीट और विजडम का जो ट्रायंगल बनता है इसको आप कैसे देखते हैं कि क्या जो मिलिट्री डिफीट है वही जाके एक वो बनती है कि भाई उसी से आप सीखेंगे या ह्यूमन कैपेसिटी है कि वो उसको फोर्सी करते हुए कुछ और अल्टरनेटिव पॉलिसीज जो हैं उन पे उसको कंसिडर करें।
देखिए जो मिलिट्री डिफीट्स हैं तो उससे कभी कभार आप सही लेसन ड्रॉ करते हैं एंड कभी कभार आप गलत लेसन भी ड्रॉ करते हैं and कभी कभार you might learn that lesson, the correct lesson for a while, but वक्त के साथ साथ you go back to the wrong policy. So just to give you an example of this, the Americans intervened and lost in Vietnam. So you would imagine that the United States, after that defeat for a very long time, वो उस तरह की military intervention दोबारा नहीं करेंगे. But that's exactly what they did in Afghanistan just 26 years after they were driven out of Vietnam. So for a short while you might think कि ठीक है वो improvement होगी, but the way this goes that basically once there is a generational turnover, very often those lessons are forgotten. So we have to be careful when we think that a defeat would lead to long-term successful rethinking. बाकी जो है the thing is that the only way that these transitions occur is either through the military defeat of one or more of the powers जो उस transition को contest कर रहे हैं, or one of the powers, as happened with the Soviet Union, collapses from exhaustion of having to fight that prolonged conflict. So, uh, those are the two ways in which these transitions occur. So, if let's say the United States collapses, like let's say Russia did at the end of the Cold War, then that would create a totally changed geopolitical landscape. अगर अमेरिका का economic collapse हो जाता है, their political system explodes into chaos, their administration breaks down, and they turn inwards for a prolonged period, then you will end up with a very, very different world. But if conversely something similar happens in China, you might then see a reassertion of American supremacy.
ठीक, तो ये जो सिनारियो है यूएस का इंटरनल कोलैप्स का, इस पे बात तो बहुत होती है और ट्रम्प के साथ इसको एसोसिएट भी किया जाता है कि जोहान गोल्टन ने फॉर एग्जांपल डिक्लाइन ऑफ यूएस की बात की थी। तो उसने जब ट्रम्प ने लास्ट टाइम टेक ओवर किया था तो उसने कहा था कि भाई मैंने जो कैलकुलेट किया था उसमें से 5 साल और कम कर लें, लेकिन अभी सो फार तो हमें वो चीज़ नज़र नहीं आती। आपने रिसेंटली विजिट भी किया यूएस का, तो इंटरनल जो प्रॉब्लम है, जो वहाँ के कुछ ऑब्जर्वर हैं वो ये बात करते हैं कि एक रिएक्शन वहाँ पे ट्रम्प के अगेंस्ट जो है वो डेवलप हो रहा है। अब ये क्या सिचुएशन इख्तियार करेगा, ये अभी मुश्किल है ये कहना कि क्या सूरत हाल होगी, कि क्या वो सक्सेसफुल होगा तो हम बैक टू वही डेमोक्रेसी और उसकी रेट्रिक पे जाएंगे, या ये कंटिन्यू करेगा। इस पे आप क्या कहोगे?
देखिए, जो ट्रम्प है, एंड मोर इम्पोर्टेंटली जो ट्रम्प के साथ जो एक कंजर्वेटिव इंटेलिजेंसी अटैच हो गई है, उनकी थिंकिंग ये है कि अगर हमने यूएस को दुनिया का नंबर 1 पावर रखना है तो हमें अपनी जो कमिटमेंट्स हैं उनको रैशनलाइज करना पड़ेगा। जो हमारे एलाइज हैं उनको अपना फेयर शेयर देना पड़ेगा in terms of military spending, in terms of military power and other such things. So the Americans feel that अगर हम ये चीज़ें कर लें while we enjoy overall global supremacy, then we can restructure that global supremacy and put more of the cost of maintaining that supremacy onto our allies. So, Trump जो है, he is sometimes actually sold as some sort of an isolationist, और उसकी कुछ rhetoric उस तरह की definitely है, but fundamentally I think what he is saying is, and what his supporters also say, is that the US has to rationalize its commitments. कि basically आपका जो sphere of influence है, जो global sphere of influence है, वो अब आप अपने डोमेस्टिक नेशनल रिसोर्सेज के थ्रू उसको आप अब मेंटेन नहीं कर सकते। सो अगर आप इसी तरह एक टोटली यूनिपोलर सिस्टम को मेंटेन करने की कोशिश करेंगे, देन इवेंचुअली यू आर गोइंग, और इवन सूनर यू विल फाइंड योरसेल्फ एग्जॉस्टेड। उस एग्जॉस्शन को प्रीएम्प्ट करने के लिए दे आर ऑफ द व्यू कि भाई अगर हमारे ईस्ट एशियन एलाइज हैं तो उनको ज़्यादा वेट उठाना चाहिए ऑफ कंटेनिंग द चाइनीज, अगर हमारे यूरोपियन एलाइज हैं तो उनको ज़्यादा वजन उठाना चाहिए एज फार एज रशिया इज कंसर्न, नेटो को अपनी मिलिट्री स्पेंडिंग इंक्रीज करनी चाहिए टू क्रिएट दैट ट्रांसफर। सो आई थिंक दिस इज इन अ वे हाउ द अमेरिकन्स वांट टू मैनेज दैट डिक्लाइन। So I don't think Trump is actually an isolationist. Again, अगर आप बात करते हैं let's say globalization के ऊपर, तो Trump की objection with globalization isn't that globalization is good or bad. It is that जिस तरह से अमेरिकनों ने globalization pursue की है post 1992, that has led to the offshoring of most of the United States' basic manufacturing capacity. So he is happy if the rest of the world buys stuff from the US, but what he wants is कि ये capacity वापस आ जाए. अब वो एक different story है कि can it return to the US? You know, a lot of economists are also pointing out that actually that type of manufacturing cannot come back to the US uh, due to the cost of production, due to the fact the US no longer has an advantage in producing these items, due to the fact that the items, if the US tries to produce them, they'll be just too expensive. तो आपका अपना स्टैंडर्ड ऑफ लिविंग जो है वो एडवर्सली इफेक्ट होगा इस तरह की पॉलिसी से.
ठीक. तो जो पोस्ट सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर जो इंटरनेशनल जो कह लें कि इंस्टीट्यूशंस थे, अब यूएस जो है उसमें भी वो उनमें इतना इंटरेस्टेड नहीं है उसके थ्रू गवर्नेंस में, जो अपरेंटली हमें दिखाई देता है. तो अब ये जो इंटरनेशनलिज्म था ग्लोबल, जो सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर के बाद जो कंसीव किया गया, जिसमें यूएन भी है, बाकी इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं, तो उसके एब्सेंस में क्या मतलब जो पावर पॉलिटिक्स है और रीजनल जो हेजमन्स हैं, ये एक नई पैराडाइम है ग्लोबल जो कह लें कंट्रोल की या ऑर्डर को मेंटेन रखने की. तो इंस्टीट्यूशंस का रोल आप कहाँ पे देखते हैं जो इंटरनेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं?
देखिए, टू वेज टू थिंक अबाउट इट. एक तो ये है कि एज लेट्स से चाइना राइजेस, अगर वो एक पैरेलल आर्किटेक्चर बनाते हैं इंटरनेशनल फाइनेंस का, इंटरनेशनल इन्वेस्टमेंट का, ट्रेड का, बाकी चीज़ों का, तो वो उनके राइज के साथ साथ मोर एंड मोर कंट्रीज उस तरफ आ जाते हैं. तो उसका मतलब ये है कि बेसिकली आप एक लेट्स से यूएस सेंट्रिक इंटरनेशनलिज्म को रिप्लेस कर रहे हैं विद ए साइनोसेंट्रिक इंटरनेशनलिज्म. सो जहाँ पे लेट्स से वर्ल्ड बैंक है या IMF है, मे बी एशियन इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर बैंक विल प्ले दैट रोल, और ब्रिक्स विल प्ले सम सॉर्ट ऑफ रोल और समथिंग टू दैट इफेक्ट. बट अभी तक कोई इस तरह का फर्म ऑल्टरनेटिव स्ट्रक्चर जो है चीनियों ने नहीं दिया है. सो देयर इज दैट एलिमेंट एज वेल. The other option of course is कि ये जो international institutions थी, उनका हमेशा मकसद यही था कि जो ग्रेट पावर्स हैं, जिसमें से अमेरिकन द ग्रेटेस्ट पावर, उनके इंटरेस्ट्स को प्रोटेक्ट किया जाए और उनकी जो प्रेजेंस है एट द टॉप ऑफ द पिरामिड उसको लेजिटिमाइज किया जाए. सो यूएन या बाकी जो इस तरह की एजेंसीज हैं, ठीक है, उनके बहुत सारे इंपॉर्टेंट टेक्निकल काम है जो वो करते हैं, जो शायद आइंदा भी वो करते हैं, बट जो उनका एक पॉलिटिकल रोल है वो कंस्ट्रेंड है बाय ग्रेट पावर कंसेंसस. तो अगर 5 ग्रेट पावर्स में से यानी कि जो परमानेंट मेंबर्स हैं वो एग्री नहीं करते, तो फिर द यूएन इज पैरालाइज्ड, इट कांट डू एनीथिंग. बाकी जो है ऑन द ग्राउंड आप जो मर्जी कर लें. अगर आपके पास जो है वो ग्लोबल पावर है और इन्फ्लुएंस है, तो आप जो है यानी कि अपने फ़ोन उठाएं तो यू हैव अ जेनोसाइड बीइंग लाइव स्ट्रीम फॉर द लास्ट 2 years ऑलमोस्ट. क्या फ़र्क पड़ा है आपके ट्वीट करने से या फेसबुक पे पोस्ट करने से? जेनोसाइड तो हो रहा है. सो I think there is also that element that we need to understand, that giving people the illusion of hope that you might get justice through some sort of fancy mechanism at The Hague or whatever is a part of this conjuring trick, if you will. But that's what it is. The fact is that if you have the strength, you can do whatever you feel like, and you don't need to recognize any authority other than your own state.
तो गोया ये जो हमने सारा इस रोमांस में वक्त गुजारा कि डेमोक्रेसी, ह्यूमन राइट्स, तो ये इट वाज अ मोमेंट ऑफ इल्यूजन एक्चुअली. दिस इज व्हाट यू आर सेइंग.
इन द सेंस कि आपके अपने मुल्क के लिए
जी।
अगर आपके अपने मुल्क में ये चीज़ें होती हैं
हम्म,
एक उसकी इंटरनल एवोल्यूशनरी प्रोसेस की वजह से, तो आई वुड से कि वो बहुत अच्छी बात है, होनी चाहिए। और अगर नहीं होती तो यू माइट आर्ग्यू कि दैट इज़ एन अनफॉर्चुनेट आउटकम, बट दैट हैज़ नो बेयरिंग ऑन द ओवरऑल इंटरनेशनल सिस्टम।
इसके लिए अब कोई उम्मीद आप देखते हैं जब मतलब ग्लोबल जो पावर सेंटर्स हैं या जो डेमोक्रेसी के सेंटर्स भी थे वहाँ पे भी अब ये अगर रिसर्जेंस जो है वो बिल्कुल जो है वो पावर और फोर्स की अगर बात है तो डेमोक्रेसी के लिए पाकिस्तान में तो पहले ही जो इंटरनल इतनी ओनरशिप मैंने समझता हूँ कि नहीं कभी देखी कि यहाँ पे लोकल कोई ऐसे सेंटर्स हों जो डेमोक्रेसी को ओन करते हो उसको लेके चलना चाहते हो। तो फिर अब हमारे लिए क्या इसमें डेमोक्रेटिक फ्यूचर के हवाले से होप के लिए क्या बचा है?
देखिए, बात तो ये है कि कोई बाहर से आके तो आपको यहाँ पे जमहूरियत तो नहीं लगा सकता, एंड इंटरनली आपके जो पावर सेंटर्स हैं और उसके साथ जो जैसे बिजनेस कम्युनिटी है, बाकी जो इम्पोर्टेंट जो सेगमेंट्स हैं ऑफ द सोसाइटी, दे आर willing to forego
ठीक।
on the democratic front in exchange कि अगर उनके इंटरेस्ट जो है
हाँ,
कुछ हद
ठीक।
तक प्रोटेक्ट हो जाए अंडर द सिस्टम।
हम्म,
सो आपके यहाँ तो एक बेसिकली सॉर्ट ऑफ रिलेटिवली वीक ऑटोक्रेसी चल जाती है, और जब वो उसका इंटरनल डायनामिक ज़्यादा अनस्टेबल हो जाता है तो वो फिर एक वीक डेमोक्रेसी में कन्वर्ट हो जाती है,
ऐसे ही।
और जब उसका डायनामिक अनस्टेबल हो जाता है तो फिर वो दोबारा से एक वीक ऑटोक्रेसी बन जाती है।
ऐसे ही है। जी और कोई याद करेंगे आप? जी।
अच्छा जी, सबसे पहले तो थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर दिस वंडरफुल ओवरव्यू ऑफ वर्ल्ड हिस्ट्री लीडिंग अप टू वर्ल्ड वॉर्स, टू वर्ल्ड वॉर्स एंड फॉर्मिंग ऑफ वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर्स। मैं एक सिंपल सा क्वेश्चन आप ही से रिलेटेड जो आपने बात की है कि जब ट्रम्प ये कहता है कि मेकिंग अमेरिका ग्रेट अगेन, व्हाट डज ही मीन?
ठीक।
और उसका इम्प्लीकेशन वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर या इस ट्रांजिशन पर क्या होगा, क्योंकि उसने बहुत सारी पॉलिसी रिवर्स की है, जैसे इन्होंने जिक्र किया ह्यूमन राइट्स के ऊपर, डेमोक्रेसी की एक्सपेंशन और प्रमोशन के ऊपर, इमिग्रेशन के ऊपर, जेंडर के ऊपर, जो एक ग्लोबल एजेंडा था ग्लोबलाइजेशन का, और खुद ग्लोबलाइजेशन को वो फेवर नहीं कर रहा है, तो वो इन वर्ल्ड देख रहा है। तो जब वो कहता है कि अमेरिका को मैं ग्रेट बनाऊंगा दोबारा से, तो उसका एग्जैक्ट मतलब है क्या, और वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर पे उसका असर क्या पड़ेगा?
मेरा सवाल भी मिलता जुलता है, तो मैं ऐड कर
Sure,
दूं
sure.
इसमें। One of the major causes of world wars was the nationalism. I think हमें उसी एक कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखना होगा कि ये जो वर्ल्ड वाइड एक फिनोमेना हमने देखा है रिसेंटली, राइट विंग का राइज, एंटी इमिग्रेशन पॉलिसीज, तो इनवर्ड अमेरिका फर्स्ट हो, या आज ईरान की रिपोर्ट है कि जापान में भी ये पॉलिटिकल फिनोमेना ग्रो कर रहा है। तो ये बड़ा एक वरीसम एक आई थिंक एक फैक्टर है जो कि वर्ल्ड हिस्ट्री के पर्सपेक्टिव में कि हम एक न्यूक्लियर एज में रह रहे हैं, और इंक्रीजिंगली अब तो डिजिटल एज और भी ज़्यादा हमें कनेक्टेड कर गया है, और ऊपर से न्यूक्लियर ओवरहैंग है। तो इसमें कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है, उसमें ये अप्रोच जो है ये कितनी डेंजरस हो सकती है, जिसका हम देख रहे हैं एक्सप्रेशन। फॉर एग्जांपल हमने लाइव जेनोसाइड देखी है अपनी हिस्ट्री में, एंड नथिंग कुड बी डन अबाउट इट, एंड दैट एक्सप्लेन्स कि जो इस तरह की राइट विंग इजरायली गवर्नमेंट है, या यू नो ट्रम्प का जो एक फिनोमेना है, ये क्लियरली इंडिकेट करता है कि हम फिर एक रिटर्न टू नेशनल, एक बहुत डेंजरस वर्जन ऑफ नेशनलिस्ट इम्पल्स जो है उसकी तरफ बढ़ रहे हैं। तो वो कितना आप समझते हैं ये डेंजर है, एक जो जो हम कह सकते हैं एक ऑर्डरली पावर स्ट्रक्चर को मेंटेन करने के लिए एक चैलेंज हो सकता है।
अच्छा, तो जहाँ तक ट्रंप की बात है, ट्रंप idealizes the America of the 1950s basically. He was of course growing up in the America of that time, and he often talks about the time when you had the United States as the great manufacturing country of the world, where all the important manufacturing was done within the United States. And he feels that after, let's say, the 1970s, 1980s, the United States lost that, and it remained rather a great financial power, and it still is, but fundamentally it stopped producing the goods, especially, that the world once purchased from it. So, for him, that is what he imagines to be the, let's say, golden period, if you will, of American history. And when he says make America great again, that is what he is referring to. Of course, उसमें बहुत सारी और भी चीज़ें आ जाती हैं कि 1950s में minorities का कोई ख़ास रोल नहीं था in the affairs of the country. It wasn't until 1965 that non-white immigration was allowed to the United States, for example. It also wasn't until 1965 कि जो Voting Rights Act है, उसने जो non-whites थे उनको equal voting rights दिए. So basically जो modern American democracy है, it dates from 1965 onwards, not before that. But all of these things he feels, and other conservatives feel, कि जो अमेरिका का एक core character था as a white patriarchal Christian nation with a powerful industrial base, ये सारी चीज़ें जो हैं डाइल्यूट हो गई हैं, कॉम्प्रोमाइज़ हो गई हैं, और जैसे जैसे ये चीज़ें डाइल्यूट हुई हैं या कॉम्प्रोमाइज़ हुई हैं, तो अमेरिका जो है वो कमज़ोर होता चला गया है. And by कमज़ोर what they mean is that they no longer have the same sense of national unity or purpose, or जो भी यानी कि उनकी thinking है about this. Now of course this worldview has a lot of problems with it, but it is a kind of nostalgia, if you will, for the America of the 1950s. And इस nostalgia को जो Republicans हैं उन्होंने working class को भी successfully sell किया है. They have taken now a majority of the popular vote as well in the last elections, so that's also an extraordinary achievement for the Republicans. So what it shows is that this nativism, if you will, वो अब काफ़ी जो है ये successfully sell कर रहे हैं. So but that is what he imagined. Now of course the America of the 1950s can't come back, it's just not possible, but उसको वापस लेकर आने के लिए जो इन्होंने काम करना होगा, उससे अमेरिका में पोलराइजेशन और इंस्टेबिलिटी बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ सकती है. So depending upon how much he can do and the ability of other institutions to restrain him, he may in fact succeed in plunging the United States into a serious domestic crisis.
But do you also see any deviation from the previous Republican policies during the Cold War?
नहीं, absolutely. देखें, जो Republican Party है और जो Democrats हैं दोनों, ये 1980s में जो है effectively अपने economic agenda में unify हो गए. They both started saying the same thing when it comes to the society and the economy, कि free market होना चाहिए, deregulation होनी चाहिए, privatization होनी चाहिए, free trade होनी चाहिए, और आप जो है बेसिकली मार्केट फोर्सेस को आज़ाद छोड़ दें अमेरिका के अंदर भी और दुनिया में, और वो खुद ब खुद जो है सारी चीज़ें ठीक हो जाएंगी. Trump is of the view that no, this is not the correct approach. So Trump is very different because he is an economic nationalist, if you will. So he represents a very important shift in the thinking of the Republican leadership. And interestingly enough, कि जो Democrats हैं, they are still closer to the old market-based approach than Trump. So this is also very interesting कि जो conservative party है, जिसने basically ये market fundamentalism को लेकर आए थे, उन्होंने अब उसको ditch कर दिया है. और जो so called progressive party है अमेरिका की, वो अभी भी जो है उसी चीज़ को थोड़ा बहुत टिंकर करके आगे चलाना चाहती है. And this is actually creating problems within the Democrats as well. Particularly जिस तरह से let's say उन्होंने बर्नी सैंडर्स की कैंडिडेसी को टॉर्पीडो किया, यही बात थी कि the Democratic elite would actually rather be governed by a Republican than be governed by one of the leftist members of their own party. So ये भी एक very interesting चीज़ है in that sense. ठीक. And yeah, I mean of course you're right कि जो nationalism है, जो ultra nationalism थी of the 1920s and 30s, it played a big role in World War II. Nationalism जो है taken to extremes can lead to not just internal violence but also violence between states, because जितना आप अपने population को charge करेंगे with nationalism या nationalist sentiment, उतनी ज़्यादा वो demand जो है बढ़ती चली जाती है कि आप अपने नेशनल पावर को डेमोन्स्ट्रेट करें. आप दिखाएं कि जी हम एक्चुअली इतने ताकतवर हैं, या हम दूसरे को गिरा सकते हैं आसानी से, या उसको जो है हम कंटेन कर सकते हैं या इवन डिफीट कर सकते हैं. We see this happening in India very visibly, that one of the in fact one of my colleagues at QAU, Dr. Farhan Siddiqui, he wrote an article about this called the Resolve Paradox, जो South Asian Voices में छपा था maybe a couple of months ago. And he basically explained that in India and Pakistan the problem now is, more so in India but indirectly also in Pakistan, is that अब जब भी इस तरह का crisis होगा, it is very important for the Indian government to be able to claim victory for its domestic audience in order to de-escalate. पाकिस्तान के लिए भी ये बहुत important है, but because Pakistan is so much smaller than India, अगर आप draw भी कर लें, you can sell that convincingly to your own people as a victory. But because India is so much bigger than Pakistan and has, you know, just so much more stuff than you, for them the threshold is much higher. So this leads to something which has never really happened between two nuclear powers, where the domestic political fallout of military strategic decision making in relation to another nuclear power is one of the things that can affect the policy, even the use of force. So इससे भी वो जो हिंदू नेशनलिज्म है या अल्ट्रा नेशनलिज्म है बीजेपी का, आरएसएस का, it has a very very clear relationship with that. There is a risk that if, let's say, you know, right now the Chinese don't seem to be eager to fight a Cold War with the Americans. But the problem is that if the United States is determined to fight a Cold War with China, the Chinese will have to start fighting back. when they do that, they will obviously appeal to the national sense of their population in order to rally their people to meet the American challenge. और उस नेशनलिज्म के सेंस में जो ताइवान का इशू है, जो बैक बर्नर पे पड़ा हुआ है सिंस द टाइम ऑफ द निक्सन माओ मीटिंग, वो शायद बैक बर्नर से फिर जो है वो सामने ले आए और कहें कि ठीक है जी, अगर आपने कोल्ड वॉर करनी है तो फिर आ जाओ, करते हैं ताइवान के ऊपर। सो उससे आपका जो एक डोमेस्टिक पॉलिटिकल स्टेक्स हैं वो बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ जाते हैं। बेसिकली इट बिकम्स इम्पॉसिबल टू कॉम्प्रोमाइज बिकॉज कॉम्प्रोमाइज इज सीन एज नेशनल ह्यूमिलिएशन। So given the choice between national humiliation and conflict, the leadership might opt for conflict. So that is a very dangerous situation to be in. Yeah, please.
जर्मनी की इंटेंशंस और कैपेबिलिटी यूके चैलेंज कर रहा है यूरोप के अंदर। अगर हम 2025 की बात करें तो पाकिस्तान के इंटेंशंस, पाकिस्तान की कैपेबिलिटीज विद रिस्पेक्ट टू देयर नेबर्स और जो भी फॉरेन पॉलिसी है, इनको चैलेंज करने वाले कौन है? इंडिया तो विजिबली में नजर आ रहा है। तो क्या इसके बिहाइंड द सीन्स समवॉट यूएसए और इसराइल कोई इस तरह लॉबिंग कर रहे हैं कि पाकिस्तान की कैपेबिलिटीज को भी डिमिनिश किया जाए?
अच्छा, सो द थिंग इज कि पाकिस्तान का जो मेजर स्ट्रेटेजिक राइवल है और जिसके साथ आपका ओपन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है और सस्टेन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है, वो इंडिया ही है। और द थिंग टू अंडरस्टैंड इज कि इंडिया को अमेरिकनों ने बहुत मदद दी है थ्रू द सिविल न्यूक्लियर डील, एंड इजरायलियों ने भी इंडियंस को बहुत हेल्प दी है, नॉट ओनली इन टर्म्स ऑफ मिलिट्री इक्विपमेंट बट ऑल्सो इन टर्म्स ऑफ शेयर्ड सर्वेलेंस एंड ट्रेनिंग एंड अदर फैसिलिटीज। सो अगर आपके साथ कोई जो है आपको इंगेज करना चाहता है, द बेस्ट वे फॉर देम टू एंगेज यू इज बाय हेल्पिंग द इंडियंस, बिकॉज इंडियंस तो 24/7 लगे हुए हैं आपको नुकसान पहुंचाने में, एंड टू बी ऑनेस्ट आप भी 24/7 लगे हुए हैं उनको नुकसान पहुंचाने में। सो द बेस्ट थिंग टू डू फॉर एनीवन is to reinforce the Indians and let the Indians then assume the direct political risk. So if you look at the statement after the Pahalgam massacre that the American Vice President made, he was clearly indicating कि ठीक है ये चीज़ हो गई है एंड अब इंडिया जो भी करेगा वो करेगा, हमारा इससे कोई लेना देना नहीं है, ठीक। Even when the military conflict had started, the initial statements were that, well, let's see what happens, it's up to them, that sort of stuff. But when things started going badly for the Indians, then there was a rapid move to the ceasefire karao. So that's also something to consider, that इनके इनिशियल असेसमेंट में आई थिंक अमेरिका का, यूरोपियन पावर्स का यही ख्याल था that the Indians will basically do to Pakistan what the Israelis do to Lebanon or Syria, and ठीक है आप अपने टीवी पे बैठ के जो है तकरीरें ही कर लें, बट आपसे होना कुछ नहीं है, because the Indians they have the much better military kits. They have European and Russian kits, they have Israeli kits, you have 80% Chinese equipment, which is regarded as basically the economy package, if you will, that countries that don't have money opt for. Okay? So when things went the opposite of expectations, then all of a sudden ये सारी calculations जो है वो change हुई। So I think for anyone who wants to harm Pakistan or who wants to complicate things for Pakistan, New Delhi's door is always open. They are more than happy to facilitate them. So why would you take a direct conflict when you can take an indirect conflict. It doesn't really make that much sense.
सर मैं इसी बात से एक थोड़ी सी इसमें ऐड करूँगी कि सर आपने कहा कि जी ठीक है हमारी इनिशियल कुछ मिसकैलकुलेशंस उनसे हुई हैं सर अब हम अगर इन्हीं क्योंकि हम जब इसके ट्रांजिशन की बात कर रहे हैं ना तो हम देखते हैं कि हमारे जो पुराने एपिसोड्स हैं हमारे वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर के वो थोड़े से जो थे वो आप 1910 से 40 तक देख लें फिर 40 से कोल्ड वार एंड होने तक फिर पोस्ट कोल्ड वार का पीरियड आता है तो सर अभी अगर हम पिछले 10 साल में देखते हैं तो जो पावर सेंटर्स हैं ना लाइक जो पावर शिफ्ट है वो बड़ी ड्रामेटिकली हो रही है कि आप कभी हमें लग रहा होता है कि ठीक है हम इस चीज़ से इनकार नहीं कर सकते कि यूएसए जो है वो अभी भी जो है वो एक सुपर पावर है दुनिया को चला रहा है कि अब ठीक है चाइना इकोनॉमिकली स्ट्रांग हो रहा है वो साउथ चाइना की तरफ सी की तरफ एक्सपैंड कर रहा है लेकिन सारे चोक पॉइंट्स पे तो उसके फ्लीट्स बैठे हुए हैं यूएस दुनिया का सबसे बड़ा आर्म्स डीलर है वॉर इकोनॉमी को अगर हम साइड पे भी रख दें फिर भी हम जब ये देखते हैं कि सर जब ये पाकिस्तान और इंडिया का एपिसोड होता है 2019 वाला जो एपिसोड था उसमें हमें ये देखने को मिलता है कि ठीक है इंडिया के एक जेट भी हम डाउन करते हैं लेकिन उस वक्त सारे का सारा जो नैरेटिव था या फोकस था उसमें पाकिस्तान कहीं पीछे रह जाता है कि अब मोदी की उसके